Federal agents have stormed Fort Bragg after investigators uncovered a chilling alleged conspiracy that could expose one of the biggest military corruption scandals in years.
The base was quiet, the way only military installations can be quiet at 4 in the morning. Not silent, but disciplined. A row of Humvees sat under the sodium lights of Motor Pool 14, their hoods cold. A single fluorescent tube flickered inside the supply office window, the way it had flickered for months. The wind moved across the parade field and through the wire, and somewhere past the third checkpoint, a generator hummed in a building that, according to the duty roster, was unoccupied. The badge logs said otherwise. Her name was Renee. She was 26 years old, 3 months into a civilian contractor position with the installation's Inventory Reconciliation Office, and she was the kind of new hire nobody briefed because nobody expected her to look closely. Her job was to match shipping manifests against intake logs for non-sensitive equipment, boots, tent stakes, field radios that had been decommissioned. On the Tuesday after Labor Day, she pulled a manifest for a routine shipment of expired medical supplies marked for disposal, and noticed the weight listed on the truck was 480 pounds heavier than the inventory accounted for. She flagged it, the way she had been trained. The supervisor told her it was a rounding error. She wrote the discrepancy down anyway, on a yellow sticky note, and stuck it inside the cover of her desk planner. Renee did not know it yet, but she had just become the first person outside the system to see it. The case was opened formally on October 11th under joint FBI and DOJ jurisdiction, filed as FBI 3318-NC, with the Public Integrity Section providing federal oversight and the Army's Criminal Investigation Division attached in a supporting capacity. The target on the cover sheet was a non-commissioned officer assigned to a specialized logistics element inside one of Fort Bragg's elite Special Forces commands. The referral had come from an interagency financial review routed through a low-level analyst at Treasury who had noticed a pattern in suspicious activity reports tied to 3 civilian-registered LLCs operating in Cumberland and Hoke counties. On paper, it was a standard financial integrity inquiry. On paper. The first 3 anomalies investigators logged before the end of October were the kind that did not survive being read together. The first was a fuel requisition signed by a warrant officer who had been medically retired 11 months earlier, his signature appearing on 6 separate transport orders dated after his discharge. The second was a vendor contract for $217,840 awarded to a logistics consultancy whose registered business address turned out to be a self-storage unit in Fayetteville with no employees, no website, and a corporate filing dated 41 days before the contract was issued. The third was a shipment manifest for body armor inserts, Generation IV ceramic plates, whose lot number, when cross-referenced against the manufacturer's records, had not yet entered production at the time the shipment was logged as received. 3 small things. Each one, on its own, could be explained. Together, they could not. If you're still here, stay with me. This next part is where investigators stopped sleeping. And if you want more stories the headlines walked past, tap subscribe. Quietly, the way this whole case started. The slow walk inward began on October 23rd, with a subpoena served not to a soldier, but to a bank. The records came back 14 days later, and the first thing that caught the lead agent's attention was not the volume of money, though the volume was significant, but the rhythm. Deposits of $9,400 and $9,600 made into a personal account belonging to Staff Sergeant J.H., timed to the 2nd and 4th Friday of every month for 29 consecutive months, just below the federal reporting threshold. Just regular enough to look like a side business. The total, when investigators added it together, came to $548,600 across that window. None of it was reported on his federal tax return. On November 9th, agents pulled the gate logs for Motor Pool 14 and cross-referenced them against the duty roster. On 43 separate occasions between January and October, the side gate had been opened between 02:30 and 04:10 hours, using a maintenance access card registered to a sergeant first class who, on 31 of those nights, had been documented elsewhere, at home, on leave, or on a training rotation in Georgia. The card had been cloned. Investigators would later determine it had been cloned twice, by 2 different people, using equipment that should not have been on the installation in the first place. The pen drive was found on November 21st, inside a locked drawer in a shared office in Building 4-2210, taped to the underside of a hanging file folder labeled Quarterly Expenditures, Archive. It contained 412 files, spreadsheets, encrypted message exports, photographs of cargo pallets, taken from inside what appeared to be a hangar at the civilian-adjacent airfield. A single text document, 11 pages long, titled simply Notes.txt, written in the casual cadence of someone keeping a private journal of a project they were proud of. The detail that stayed with investigators was not the spreadsheets. It was a margin annotation, handwritten in red pen on a printed manifest tucked beside the drive. 3 words, underlined twice: "Don't ship Tuesdays." By the time the warrant was served on December 4th, agents already knew what they would find. The interesting part was what they didn't expect to find next to it. What they found next to it was a second filing cabinet in a back office of a Quonset hut that did not appear on any current facility's map, containing 13 bankers' boxes of physical records. Bills of lading, shipping manifests for cargo described only as training consumables. Photocopies of customs declarations from a small private airstrip outside Laredo, Texas. Photographs of vehicles, civilian pickup trucks with North Carolina plates, being unloaded inside a warehouse in Reynosa, Tamaulipas. The cargo, when investigators traced it backward through the paperwork, included pharmaceutical-grade precursor chemicals, 4 crates of military-issue night vision optics that had been logged as destroyed in 2022, and a quantity of U.S. currency that the indictment would later describe only as in excess of $3.2 million. The volume was not what unsettled the agents. The volume of paperwork was. Everything had been signed. That was the problem. And then they found the second figure. Staff Sergeant J.H. was the name on the cover sheet, and J.H. had moved the cargo, and J.H. had cloned the access card, and J.H. would eventually plead to the most serious of the charges. But J.H. had not designed any of it. The architecture belonged to a man named in seized communications only as the bookkeeper. His real name was Daniel, a retired Army warrant officer, 58 years old, who had separated from service in 2019 after a 26-year career in logistics and supply chain administration. He had been hired back the following year as a GS-12 civilian contractor inside the same office he had once run in uniform. He had a security clearance. He had a key card. He had 30 years of institutional memory about which forms were checked, which weren't, which signatures triggered review, and which signatures were assumed. Daniel had filed his own taxes correctly for 31 years. Investigators would find a journal entry on his personal laptop, dated 4 months before any of this began, that read, "The numbers don't have to lie. They only have to be tired enough that no one reads them twice." J.H. was the signature. Daniel was the pen. Take a breath here. I had to, the first time I read the file, because the next page is where this stops being a fraud case and starts being something the public was never supposed to see. The pre-dawn raid the public saw on the morning of January 16th was clean, coordinated, and brief. 11 arrests across 3 counties. Encrypted devices seized, financial records carted out of 2 civilian residences in plastic bins. A press conference at the federal courthouse in Raleigh later that afternoon, where a U.S. attorney described the operation as the dismantling of a criminal enterprise operating in the shadow of one of our nation's most decorated commands. 5 Special Forces personnel, 2 civilian contractors, and 4 outside associates were named in the initial indictment. The figures recovered were significant. The press release cited $14.7 million in assets seized, weapons recovered, and a network of shell companies comprehensively unwound. Sentences would be sought. Reform would be promised. The Department of the Army issued a statement expressing confidence in the integrity of the broader force. That was the version released to the press. The version inside the file was 42 pages longer. Those 42 pages contained an internal review, dated November 30th, conducted by the Office of Inspector General at the request of the FBI's Public Corruption Unit. The review identified that between 2021 and 2024, 17 internal audits of the same logistics element had been opened and closed without any substantive findings. Each of those audits had been routed for final sign-off through the same office. The office of a senior civilian official with regional oversight authority over installation contracting compliance. A man whose name appears in the unsealed portions of the indictment only as a witness, never a defendant. He had been warned, in writing, on 9 separate occasions by a junior analyst inside his own office, beginning in March of 2022, that the contracting patterns coming out of Fort Bragg's Specialized Logistics Command did not pass even basic statistical screening. Each warning had been acknowledged. Each had been filed. None had been escalated. The template, when investigators began looking for it, was not unique to Fort Bragg. Nearly identical contracting structures, the same shell company architecture, the same below-threshold deposit rhythm, the same cloned credential pattern, were identified in preliminary reviews at 2 other installations, one in Kentucky and one in Washington state. The total dollar volume routed through the combined networks across what investigators are now describing as a 4-state footprint exceeds $340 million across 9 years. The cartel relationship, in the version of the file the public was given, was described as opportunistic. In the version of the file investigators are still working through, it appears to have been structural, a logistics arrangement that predated the current personnel, inherited from a previous rotation, maintained because it worked. This was not a failure of the system. The system performed exactly as it had been quietly reconfigured to perform. There is a woman in Fayetteville named Marisol. Her husband was a sergeant first class. He died in what was officially classified as a single-vehicle accident on a county road outside the installation, in the spring of 2023. He had told her, the night before, that he was going to talk to someone the next morning about something he had seen at the motor pool. She has the voicemail he left her that afternoon, around lunchtime. It is 11 seconds long. He says he loves her. He says he will be home for dinner. He says he is glad he made the call. She still keeps it on her phone. The investigation into his death was closed within 6 weeks. What the file still does not say is who, exactly, authorized the original arrangement. Whether it began as a sanctioned operational logistics channel that was later privatized by the people running it, or whether it had been private from the start and only made to look operational. The file does not say how many of the 17 ignored audits were ignored out of negligence and how many were ignored out of instruction. The file does not say whether the 2 other installations identified in the template review are the end of the pattern or the middle of it. What investigators have allowed themselves to say, in the careful language of people who know what they are looking at, is that the architecture appears to exist in places that have not yet been audited, and that the audits, when they happen, will need to be conducted by people outside the chain of command that approved the last 17. If this story stayed with you, comment filed below. It tells me you want the ones the headlines skipped. Subscribe if you want to be here when the next file opens. There's no shouting on this channel, just the parts that were left out. The next file moves west, to a contracting office in Nevada, a warehouse that was never inventoried, and a retired colonel whose signature appears on documents dated 3 years after he stopped signing anything at all. The next file is already open,